So, well, I have no words for those Natlan designs in the preview because whatever are those, yikes. But nonetheless, I do have words to answer the question, is Genshin Impact obligated to give us good representation? Because on one hand, you could argue that it's just a game, so it doesn't have to be true to real life. And on the other hand, you could argue, well, all the points I'm gonna be presenting right now. But don't worry, because I don't aim to sound super negative and ranty, although I could technically. Instead, I'm going to talk about the nature of this specific game, its purpose, as well as the expectations and duties associated with it, coming from a fan and consistent player since 2021. If you find this sort of commentary interesting, I hope you could consider subscribing to the channel to review other content of mine. Also, I will give a bit of a background about myself to contextualize this discussion. I'm mixed Filipino, Chinese, and Indian, and I live in the Philippines. That means I can speak on some stuff in the game, but definitely not a large bulk of it. I'm also fair-skinned, even if it's not a dewy skincare commercial type of white, so naturally I won't fully understand the struggles that darker-skinned people face. So I'm mainly relying on discourse I've heard, stuff other people have told me. So if you want to add context to my video, feel free to comment, and you can also tag me on Twitter at PurpleTarotBurb. The thing about the question of whether a piece of media is obligated to provide good representation is that people attempt to answer it definitively as a whole, but the degree depends on the story and the world. Of course, it's highly encouraged for pieces of media nowadays to include minorities simply because minorities do exist almost everywhere, so it's not super out of place to include them in your story. But the number of characters they are required to add depends on the setting. Now with Genshin Impact, its setting involves 7 nations, with each nation directly referencing real-life cultures. It's unique compared to other fantasy settings. Like, you'll have some fairy realms that don't aim to remind you of specific cultures. For instance, Tinkerbell has a name that's just 2 words mashed together, and her dress is made of leaves. Like, she doesn't look like she comes from a real-life country during a particular historical era. There are some other high fantasy settings that vaguely reference medieval Europe, but some of their names are made up or have Latin vibes but may or may not actually be Latin. So it's not meant to be literally taken as medieval Europe. With Genshin Impact, however, you'll have characters like Ayaka, who has a Japanese name, a Japanese aesthetic. She practices Japanese sword arts and Japanese fan dances. You look at her and you know she's undeniably Japanese, even if in Teyvat language she's Inazuman. And that's the effect that Genshin Impact wants to produce. They're not making fake cultures from their imagination, so you're gonna expect a certain degree of accuracy. The game developers could have chosen to create entirely made-up cultures like the Star Nation, the Sun Nation, or whatever, where they create customs, norms, and design trends from scratch. But they didn't want to do that. Instead, they put the effort into achieving some level of recognizability and parallelism to real-life cultures, so it's their duty to commit fully. Of course, that's not a sweeping statement, like the degree of similarity between Teyvat's nations to their real-life counterparts depends on boundaries set by the world building. For example, because Teyvat is a fantasy setting, characters can have hair colors that don't occur naturally in real life. So you can find blue-haired Asian people, an Iranian blonde, an Iranian redhead, because the world building said this is allowed. The same can be said for eye colors. Hence, you don't expect realism or cultural accuracy on that specific front. The same also exists for some hairstyles and clothing, like the top knot was a popular hairstyle for men throughout history in East Asia, but you don't find that in Genshin because other hairstyles are popular in Teyvat. And women used to wear really long dresses in Europe, but you won't find that for playable characters in Mondstadt and Fontaine due to the fashion norms that the game set. Still, there are some other fashion accessories or articles of clothing that are inspired by real-life cultures, so only some parts of them are changed for the playable characters. Even when it comes to religion, there are real-life cultures that are polytheistic, but their Teyvat counterparts become sort of monotheistic because each nation can only worship one god, pretty much. That's allowed because of the pre-established rules about the relationship between archons and their people. So even if there are many gods in Chinese and Japanese religions, even South Asian religions, Liyue, Inazuma, and Sumeru have to all be monotheistic. It's fine because it's consistent. This also translates to some cultural attitudes, like Teyvat has some settings from historical eras, but the characters don't adhere to traditional conservative attitudes. So for example, despite some real-life cultures being horribly misogynistic, it doesn't translate to Teyvat because this was the fantasy world that the writers wanted to create. But aside from those things, there are other traits of characters that directly parallel real life. For instance, Dia's Tajin exists in real life from North Africa, which matches her name being Amazigh. And most importantly, her skin color is considered as a racial identifier. So despite eye, hair color, and fashion in Teyvat not working exactly like real life, they have established that skin color and cultural customs mirror real life. That's why we expect these particular aspects to be transferred to the game because that's how it has always been. Hence, people expect darker skinned characters from Natlan because Natlan is really undeniably trying to mimic ancient or Native American and African societies. It's a racial identifier that we expect to see in the game because they themselves said it for Vanessa in the comic. Venti said this is how people of the Pyro Archon look like. They have tan to dark skin. Aside from their skin tones, the characters' lifestyles match real-life cultures. Lantern Rite is basically just Chinese New Year for Liyue. Nilu's dance form is apparently something that Iranians actually perform. Fontaine is home to opera because of its popularity in 18th to 19th century Western Europe. Because of this, you can't say that people are only imposing their own standards for representation out of nowhere. Though I will say Khaenri'ah people seem to have names from Norse mythology, but their clothes and culture are basically just emo and indigo. So it's not necessarily meant to make you think of actual Scandinavian society, I think. Hence, I don't think there are many calls for accurate representation in Khaenri'ah. However, the Seven Nations don't work like Khaenri'ah due to their direct parallels to real-life society, so they're subject to more criticism. Basically, what I'm trying to say is cultural accuracy and hence good representation is necessary because it's something the world building commits to. Of course, you can identify which particular aspects of culture and race get transferred from real life to the game and which ones don't, and these rules must remain consistent. Other games don't need to attempt this because they're not trying to create parallels with real-life cultures, but Genshin is doing that already, so it's their duty to be faithful. If they couldn't be consistent, then they shouldn't have attempted this style of world building in the first place. Of course, I'm grateful that Genshin attempted a more diverse fantasy world building, since fantasy is usually associated with European inspiration, but this attempt comes with its own burdens and obligations. It's not something you can half-ass. Accurate cultural representation is also important because of how players experience the game. When you play Genshin, you often feel sucked into that world, forgetting that your rice cooker is done cooking your rice. It's able to do this because all of the elements of the world feel convincing enough that you can believe everything you're experiencing according to your understanding of Teyvat. Well, immersion is not exactly the same as realism because these characters control elements and such, but I mean once you've conditioned yourself to believe that humans can gain elemental powers as long as they gain a vision and that plants can record memories, plus some other magical stuff, everything else falls into a certain logic neatly. You're required to suspend disbelief for fantasy settings, but only until a certain limit. Like, you can accept that the character can fly in Genshin, but you can't accept that they'd feel sad after getting a discount on their purchase. There are things you can convince yourself to believe and other things that you just can't. Similarly, it's hard to suspend disbelief when you see a character looking out of place in a nation where they're supposedly from, unless they have immigrant lineage. Seeing white-skinned characters in ancient American and African settings is just something that doesn't add up. It looks fake and frankly hard to take seriously. Your brain is left questioning why for roughly a minute, so you don't get the same comfort you usually obtain from seeing new characters in their natural environment. Surprisingly, however, lots of the comments under that preview video were positive, with very few pointing out the skin color disparity. So, it seems as though the feeling of immersion is subjective and there is the possibility of feeling immersed enough as long as you shut off your brain. However, for people with a greater level of cultural awareness, especially if they're from the represented regions, simply shutting off their brains doesn't work because the break in immersion is felt in their gut, you know? They know because it goes against what they've seen from their upbringing, from the people around them. Even for players who are not from the same cultural background as the characters in question, if they've researched well enough about things, then the association would have formed in their heads already. So the information gets drawn from their mental resources automatically. Chances are you have a mental picture, and it doesn't take a lot of step-by-step thinking to realize that your mental picture of American and African tribes doesn't match the preview. So for the game to create a pleasant and genuinely enjoyable experience for everyone, it has to depict cultures accurately to avoid creating jarring breaks in immersion. Because even if not all players experience the same phenomenon, a significant chunk of the player base will get this weird feeling when seeing white skin in Natlan. Even some East Asian players who are unfairly stereotyped as being ignorant on racism and colorism are complaining to some degree. With this in mind, there's a case for good representation to make sure that nearly the entire player base is mentally and emotionally comfortable as they're playing their comfort game. And if the racists are uncomfortable, well, that's their own fault for not watching the Travail teaser. Nonetheless, I will admit that there are cases of people carrying wrong mental images, thinking that they're the ones who are advocates for good representation. Like lots of fans, including me at first, thought that Nilu was horrible representation and that her character design was Orientalist. But after seeing Iranian people react to her, it turns out that she's quite good representation in terms of her name, motifs, and lore. Even her design is decent except for the dress, as I've heard. So fans also have a duty to fact-check their assumptions. I think another argument in favor of requiring Genshin to have good representation is that it's a game that attempts to be artistic, I believe. And artists typically aim to produce high-quality outputs. Of course, you could pull great art concepts out of your ass, but a lot of the time, more thorough research can serve as a good source of inspiration to give you better ideas. Especially when you're trying to depict real-life cultures, accuracy reflects rigor and attention to detail, which is something that fans can notice. Yes, artists shouldn't feel extremely restricted to 100% accuracy, but any deviations from real life should be intentionally added rather than being unintentionally wrong. Like for instance, Tengu are traditionally depicted with long red noses or beak-like mouths, but since they wanted Kujo-Sara to be more human, they turned that into a mask that all Tengus have. And this mask is implied to only be removable when they are defeated. You can observe a similar case with Sino and the jackal head that you find with Anubis, so Genshin adapted it into a headdress for him. Compare that to the character design of the purple gremlin, which seems to only be inspired by stereotypes. That's an extreme case, but it shows what happens when you're not working based on a strong foundation anchored on accuracy. I think a better way to illustrate the concept of artistic integrity, at least according to the way I'm using it for this video, is by turning to Genshin Impact's soundtrack. It's arguably one of, if not the best soundtrack in the gaming industry because of how it draws from traditional music. The composers don't just give us a generic Middle Eastern sound for Sumeru, but it takes the time to give us vastly different and unique melodies incorporating sounds from traditional instruments from South Asia, West Asia, and Northern Africa. You see the sitar, the ney, the oud, and many others, and the composers know how to incorporate Western instruments intentionally. That's how amazing music is made, and you can sense the extremely high level of artistry present in these compositions. And the result is not only good solely because of the representation. It's genuinely pleasing to listen to even for people who have zero clue about traditional instruments from non-Western regions. That shows how good representation can just naturally lead to great quality. Plus, there's no issue with the representation being forced because it does fit the world building anyway, as I mentioned earlier. Aside from the music and the designs, the environment, the lore, being strongly based on real-life cultures is also important to have. It gives lore-focused players a sense of wonder, and it opens up our view of the world beyond what we know, making the messages of the stories more memorable. Accurate representation fosters uniqueness over genericness, which is an evidence of creativity. I know that a lot of people struggle with the terminology from other languages in the game, and I must admit I can't pronounce some words perfectly, but once you master the terminology like Oratrice Mécanique d'Analyse Cardinal, Vorukasha Oasis, Shirasagi Himegimi, and many more, you'll realize how much these languages give the lore more flavor. Plus, harnessing mythologies from other cultures gives writers access to new plot points and character concepts that you can't always get from looking only at European stories. With inadequate representation in terms of skin color, clothing, and other cultural elements, the artistic work ends up looking shoddy and messy. I do know that it's not an opinion shared by everyone who looks at culturally inaccurate designs because some people only care for the cuteness factor, but for some design analysts, they might find that the artistry suffers. So yeah, it's better to study the inspiration first before creating something based on it as a sort of quality assurance process. In connection with the last point, well, designs with good representation are very pretty. The designers of Hoyoverse probably still believe that white skin is the most beautiful, but that's not necessarily the case for the fans. Dia is extremely well loved by the fandom, aside from her gameplay. Of course, Kaya is popular among fans who enjoy tall male characters. People regard Candace's design to be better than that of some 5 stars, and Sino, well, even Hoyoverse loves Sino. That man is everywhere and was highly anticipated before Sumeru was released. I mean, not all of them necessarily have accurate clothing and their skin tones could still be darker, but it shows that the fandom is very fond of aesthetics along these lines. Representation and beauty don't have an inverse relationship unless you're bigoted. In fact, a character seems more beautiful when their designs reflect their culture accurately because you can tell a lot about them just by looking at them. The details are dynamic and make them come to life. I will admit that some ethnic features are not easily approachable for everyone, like kinky hair is somewhat uncommon where I'm from, so it might take people like me a long time to get used to its aesthetic, especially when under the influence of some restrictive Eurocentric beauty standards. But exposure helps to broaden our minds and can help us reconsider and abolish beauty standards that are ingrained in us. A game that guides us in updating our beauty standards will prove to be more memorable than a game that settles for cheap public approval by creating lackluster designs. Genshin Impact is kind of a mix of both of those, so it's kind of funny, but hopefully it could decide to pursue a more faithful take on designs. Lastly, an argument for Genshin to strive for good representation is that it just makes fans happy, which is a game's function. Sure, Hoyoverse can achieve player-based satisfaction even with shit representation, but it's such a magical thing to feel seen and to learn about other cultures. Personally, I'm not someone who necessarily looks for representation in popular media for my own sake because I feel like I can just watch media made in my own country, or I could just talk to people around me. But seeing good representation randomly in global media can be a pleasant surprise and can generate interest in your culture from other people, so that's great. It's even more important to see good representation of cultures that aren't your own so you can be pushed to learn more, and I personally really love having my mind opened, especially because I kind of still am a history nerd. Of course, Genshin isn't meant to necessarily teach you the perfect details of each culture it represents because it's a fantasy game, but it can be a springboard to help generate interest in certain details. I legit learned about the term Amazigh because of Dia, and apparently I thought that the offensive term for that ethnicity was the proper word to use for them before. Oh my god. And the process of education involves reaching out to other fans who are also drawn to the same good representation and talk about their cultures. I'd say that Sumeru helped me make a lot of online friends for that reason. I also find Kaya to be really special to me because he seems to be an immigrant with Indian blood, just like me. Not fully confirmed, but come on, you can see it, okay? And through analyzing his design and background, I've come to learn things about my own culture, and I get to squeal about him with fellow Indian fans online. Like, fangirling over the character becomes more intense when you realize that aside from being pretty, they're also helping to educate people and help people of the same ethnicity as them find each other in online spaces. It's a very warm feeling that's not easily replicable by other games, and I and many others believe that this is what the fandom should continue experiencing as we go through Natlan. Come on, Hoyoverse, make people from 2 large continents happy. It's not that hard. With how the internet works, I suppose the haters would have spewed out distasteful stuff in the comment section of this video and dipped out midway, so those of you who are left at this point are probably those that agree with my points already. So hi there, I hope you liked this video. I feel like what I said are just things you know already, but hopefully I was able to order and phrase the arguments in a satisfying way so that you can mention these points to your friends. I say that as if it's easy for me to talk about this stuff with my own IRL friends in the first place. Anyway, what I'll leave with you is the idea that disappointment is inevitable with Hoyoverse, but it's also a game that gives us some surprising bits of gold in certain aspects. Like recently, I enjoyed Setos's character stories, really sheds light on cultural preservation attempts by desert people. So allow yourselves to feel disappointment when it's warranted and appreciate stuff also when it's warranted. I and many others wish the game would adjust skin tones, but it's unlikely that they'll listen, especially since they'll get their revenue anyway from diehard simps who don't care about representation. So at this point, I guess all that we can do is hope for better designs for future characters who have yet to be released. And until then, I hope you can make friends to rant with because we're not in a good situation right now. If you want to continue venting your frustrations about the Natlan Preview somewhere, feel free to use the comment section to share your thoughts. If you found this video interesting despite it also being slightly stressful, then make sure to leave a like, and if you're new around here, I hope you could consider subscribing to my channel to catch more Genshin Impact commentary like this one. That's all for today, and stay tuned for my next long-winded ramble.